The British Health Minister in charge of the pandemic is now in a celebrity show eating testicles in the jungle. Meanwhile, Pfizer and Moderna are finally testing vaccines for their impact on myocarditis. So we ask, was the entire pandemic a reality show? During the pandemic, the British Health Minister was Matt Hancock. That means he was essentially in charge of the lockdown restrictions, the policies around vaccines, moving elderly people from one care home to another where they could infect one another, where lockdown measures were imposed on ordinary people that were not met by the government. He himself, of course, broke those lockdown restrictions to have an extramarital affair. Here he is doing that. The reason we're talking about this is because Pfizer and Moderna are now testing their vaccines for their impact on myocarditis. This means that the narrative around COVID continues to shift. The reason for having vaccine passports, the reason for having vaccines at all, the reasons for having lockdowns, the efficacy of vaccines, the impact of COVID. The question that we're offering you is, what kind of reality are we living in now, where a minister who a couple of years ago was in charge of these measures, who was responsible for reporting these regulations to the nation, is now in a reality TV show eating testicles, joshing and joking? I suppose the broader question that we're asking now is, what is the nature of our democracy? What is the nature of our media? What is the nature of our reality when the place that you're most likely to see a reasonable debate about the pandemic and its impact is on a reality TV show where politicians and pop stars and athletes eat animal genitalia for the amusement of the public? And how do we square that with the fact that pharmaceutical companies are now finally conducting tests for the potential impact of those vaccines on heart conditions?
What's the plan? Come out of here, write a book.
Well, I've just finished a book, Pandemic Diaries. Yeah. That's what it says on the tin.
How warts and all is it?
Totally tells the story straight.
Okay, so let's have a look at what that straight story might be. Matt Hancock gave PPE contracts to his friends. That means that some of the equipment that's used in hospitals was manufactured by companies that Matt Hancock personally awarded contracts to. In many cases, companies that had no experience in the manufacture. So it's an explicit example of what would seem to be corruption. He discharged untested residents from hospitals back into care homes, resulting in a vast death toll. The government that he was part of used legal coercion to restrict basic human freedoms of the entire population for the best part of 2 years while disobeying them themselves. Now, I suppose it's ordinary and natural that times move on, that there is progress, but has there been a real reckoning? Have we really addressed what went on in those 2 years? Have we addressed the measures that were taken medically, socially, legally, ideologically, the shaming of unvaccinated people? Again, I'm not offering you a concrete conclusion on what would have been the best way to handle that pandemic. But in retrospect, it looks like many of the measures that were taken were advantageous to pharmaceutical interests, big tech interests, government interests. I'm not saying that's why those measures were undertaken, but one of the, let's call them glorious serendipities of the entire process, is that the situation was ultimately advantageous to some very powerful interests. Now, as we move into a post-COVID world, should we call it that, we do have to recognise that many of the measures that were introduced were potentially not effective and in some cases detrimental. That's if we look at the impact on mental health, other cancers, many of the medical conditions that were neglected during that period. So the idea that we might, as one article in The Atlantic suggested, just move on and forget about it is, I think, irresponsible. I'm not saying that we should continue to stoke tensions between people who politically supported the measures of the pandemic and people who politically were against them. I recognise that a truce is necessary for people to move forward. An amnesty is one thing. That means putting aside our differences. Amnesia is where we forget what happened. Because if we forget what happened, what my concern would be is that we move into this nihilistic space without categories, where nothing has any meaning anymore, where politicians turn up on TV joking about something that a couple of years ago was ruining people's lives, that corporations aren't held to account for their actions, that medical due diligence is not correctly observed and discussed, that issues that were vehemently politicised a couple of years ago are now just sort of brushed aside and swept under the carpet. If we do that, I feel that we're moving closer to a kind of technocratic, technological dictatorship where we can't meaningfully participate in the way that our lives are governed, where we're spellbound by literal spectacles while forgetting the impact that the last 2 years had on a lot of people's lives.
You got a lockdown fine, didn't you?
No, of course I didn't.
I thought you broke lockdown rules.
No, I did not.
All right,
I didn't
Tiger.
break any.
You were socialising someone outside of your household.
Yeah, I didn't break any laws. Guidance is different, but anyway, I don't want to go.
Oh, so there's a rule and there's a law.
Guidance.
The guidance is guidance.
Right.
But the problem was it was my guidance.
Exactly.
That's why. So
Why did you break your own guidance?
Why did you break your own guidance? It's interesting that it comes down to sort of semantics and regulatory language, that guidelines were offered, like you shouldn't leave the house, you shouldn't mix with people from other households. Can you remember the moral hysteria of that period? Can you remember how people sort of went on the television to say we should condemn unvaccinated people?
Oh, you can't shame them. You can't call them stupid. You can't call them silly. Yes, they are.
Can you remember the certainty? See, now there is new ambiguity. Oh, we're not sure if that was right. We're not sure if that's correct. Some science suggests this, some tests suggest that. Well, that's not what it was like 2 years ago. 2 years ago, there was tyrannical certainty, dictatorial certainty. And those people and those interests are broadly still in power. Of course, some of the individuals are being moved on. But what I'm asserting is the same system that was in power then is in power now. A figure like Matt Hancock, in case you're American and don't understand it, can easily be scapegoated and disregarded. He seems like he might be a bit of a twit, a bit of a nitwit. But his sacrifice and humiliation on a celebrity TV show in order to sell books, while it may offer a kind of purge and a kind of venting of the antagonism that many people felt during the last couple of years, what it doesn't do is address those fundamental problems. It doesn't address the relationship between the government and the media, the government and big business. It doesn't address the ability of powerful interests to control a narrative, and in this case, to control a population. Let's remember that during that lockdown, the government that he was part of held Christmas parties, regular gatherings, were ignoring the guidelines that they themselves put in place. What was it like in your country? In California, did Gavin Newsom break guidelines that they put in place? Have you seen similar things take place all over the world? Have you heard conflicting information? Are you similarly being invited to put it aside? Do you remember when it was suggested that some of these medications might have a detrimental impact on people's health? Do you remember that that was regarded as a conspiracy theory? Have you forgotten already that it was impossible to talk about myocarditis? Now it's being talked about on mainstream media. Now, I'm not donning the tinfoil hat and banging the drum for hysterical thinking. Far from it. I'm suggesting that we recognise this for what it is, part of a spectacle, and we patiently observe medical and scientific data as it emerges, and remember that it should be retrospectively applied to the conditions and circumstances that we recently lived through.
Because
It's guidance.
it was a mistake, because I fell in love with somebody and we
And
all
I
know
was
what
taken by
happened.
love.
Well, it's true.
But you did it anyway.
Well, that's why I apologise for it.
My aunt died from COVID in the first wave.
Yeah,
So we couldn't go to the hospital to go and visit her.
yeah.
I had to sit by myself in the church at her funeral. We couldn't hug each other because we were following guidance.
Is it clear now that what we're being offered in lieu of democracy is an actual reality TV spectacle? Is this the place where you have to go to witness this conversation? Are you concerned that on a show called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, we're seeing a more explicit conversation about coronavirus and its impact than you will hear in Congress or in Parliament or any of those hearings where it seems opaque and bureaucratic, where you don't get any clear conclusions? Are you worried that reality is becoming kind of detached from your actual lived experience? While I think it's sort of interesting that that's taking place and, entertaining and sort of good in some ways, my concern is that this is what we're being offered instead of a functioning democracy. Do you remember years ago when these kind of reality TV shows became a phenomenon and people used to say, oh, it's interesting that people will vote for a singer on X Factor or Pop Idol or American Idol or whatever, but we don't have any democratic purchase when it comes to how our communities are run. And that it was seen as a sort of a joke, a humorous point to ponder, that people often remark that the biggest demographic at all, the biggest party, as it were, is the party party of people that don't bother voting at elections. Can you see the connection between this sort of odd nihilistic spectacle where people in a jungle discuss a catastrophe of a couple of years ago while voting the people in and out? Meanwhile, nothing is actually getting done about the mistakes that were made, about the lies that were told, about the profits that were made. Do you not see that these things are connected? That it's not hysterical or conspiratorial to point that out. It's simple rationality. Do you not see that that problem goes beyond Matt Hancock? It's not a single idiot in a jungle trying to launch a book. It's an entire system. Do you recognize that that system includes the media? It includes the corporations that sponsor programs like this one, that it's an entrenched, deep, systemic problem that won't be solved by sort of hard conversations undertaken in a sort of a faux jungle, or even a real jungle. It might be a real jungle. I'm not saying that the jungle is part of the problem. What I'm saying is that we're being given a kind of synthetic snack instead of a nutritious feast of true political discourse.
But sorry for a lot of families, like mine, doesn't really cut it.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I regret it as much as I do.
That's one of the reasons I regret it as much as I do. It's odd that you're invited 1 minute to look at it from an emotional perspective, in a sort of a visceral or sentimental way. And at other times we were asked to follow the science, follow the data, look at the facts. Do you see that it's kind of a global gaslighting that's taking place? Look at the facts, look at the data, consider the emotion, consider the emotion. What do you want me to do? How am I supposed to understand this? It is not sufficient to say that Matt Hancock is like one bad apple, or there are a few bad apples going to parties during lockdown, or, you know, if you don't like the Democrat Party, vote for the Republican Party, or if you don't like the Conservative Party, vote for the Labour Party. This is way beyond that. This is systemic corruption so deep and entrenched that nothing short of a total reckoning and renewal will do. Another R word is, of course, revolution, but we've been down that road. This is a serious and fundamental problem. It's a moral problem. It's an ethical problem. It's an ontological problem. A problem of meaning, of being. Who are we? What is the reality we're advocating for? What are our principles? How do you want to reorganise society? Do you want to reorganise it by having a sort of a heartfelt chat round a pretend campfire before someone goes off to eat a jar full of kangaroo bollocks? Or do you want a system where you have some ability to control your own life?
Do you have regret regarding the way that, as health minister, you dealt with the pandemic as a whole?
So the pandemic as a whole, no, I'm much, much more robust in my defence of it. Because
Even when PPE with carers?
yeah.
Now, what I'll tell you from my limited experience in television is that those people will have been briefed. I'm not saying that the whole thing is constructed, but there will have been a moment where the woman talking to Matt Hancock would have been into, I think they use a little booth in Celebrity, and they would go, what do you feel about the pandemic? And do you remember when people were released into care homes and the PPE equipment stuff? Yeah, well, it'd be good if you had a conversation with Matt. So it's not like it's a total construction, it's kind of managed reality. Obviously, we understand that, but this managed reality is, I'm afraid, much too similar to the managed reality of congressional discourse or Senate hearings or parliamentary inquiries. When Matt Hancock referenced the parliamentary inquiry, do you seriously imagine that the outcome might be the media were not explicit and transparent about the complexity of the situation? For the pharmaceutical industry were not made accountable for the vast profits that they were making. The clinical trial process was not as thorough as it ought to have been. We're only now looking at myocarditis. We banned people from discussing issues that were relevant and necessary. We condemned people, and key workers lost their jobs as a result of ideas that have since been proven to be untrue and overturned. That is not going to be the inquiry. What will happen is your attention will be moved to another conflagration, conflict or war where you'll similarly be restricted in your ability to assess and analyse it. This little TV show and this vast issue demonstrate precisely what's going on in the world right now. You're being deliberately bewildered, nauseated, kept in a bilious state where you're unable to assess reality, that induces a kind of nihilism. What is it that we're not allowed to discuss right now that in a couple of years you'll see someone on a dancing show or an ice skating show or where they're fired out of a cannon joking about it? What is it now? What potential issues? Because already this is what's going on about myocarditis, which on this platform I wouldn't have been able to discuss probably 2 months ago, 3 months ago. Listen. Both Pfizer and Moderna are launching clinical trials to track health issues, if any, in the years following a diagnosis of vaccine-associated heart problems in teens and young adults. The if any there is a superfluous phrase inserted by NBC, where we got this information from, to indicate, well, there might be none. We might find that there are none. There are certainly some interesting graphs and data available that seem to suggest that there could be significant findings in those areas. There have been around 1,000 reports of vaccine-related myocarditis or pericarditis in children under age 18, primarily young males, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Most of those who developed the condition have fully recovered, although research so far has only looked at how well they're doing after several months. Some doctors wonder if it can cause permanent damage to the heart. Do you remember at the beginning of this pandemic and the beginning of the vaccine recommendations saying, how can they possibly have clinically trialled it over a long time frame, because we haven't had a long time frame? Do you remember how those questions were looked at as akin to saying, oh, do you reckon aliens came here years ago and helped to advance human civilization? Which I also believe, actually. Now, the first research in the US is underway, tracking adverse health effects that may appear in the years following a diagnosis of vaccine-associated heart problems. Now, I recognise that people aren't perfect, that people can make mistakes, and even large corporations with very checkered histories can make legitimate errors. All I'm suggesting is that at the beginning of this pandemic and during it, there was a degree of candour in the communications. We can't possibly know what the outcomes are because we haven't been able to do extensive trials yet. We're suggesting that people take these medications, but if you were cynical about those medications, we'd certainly understand that. We're not suggesting that it's going to prevent transmission because there have been no trials around transmission. It should be a decision that people make from themselves. Do you remember that? Or do you remember Matt Hancock confidently standing behind podiums suggesting a particular moral stance? Or Joe Biden saying that this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated? Just remember that the whole thing is starting to look like a reality TV show now. Do you remember the phrase COVIDiots? Do you remember Don Lemon saying that we should stigmatise people? Like, under what circumstances is it acceptable to stigmatise anybody for anything? At some point, you're going to have a conversation with people that you disagree with if you want to have a thing called society. Early findings from the research could be published as early as next year, sources told NBC News. Now it's on mainstream media. That's how we're even able to talk to you about it, because part of our model is, in order to ensure that we are not banned, we wait for mainstream media sources to report on this stuff, and then we give you it with perhaps a little edge of serrated truth. In some cases, people who have developed myocarditis after a viral infection can suffer scarring along the heart's tissue, reducing its ability to pump blood and circulate oxygen around the body, said Dr. Leslie Cooper, the chair of the Department of Cardiology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. It's unknown how many people with vaccine-associated myocarditis will experience this scarring, he said, noting that about 20% of people with myocarditis linked to viruses go on to experience heart failure. It could be 2%, it could be 0%, it could be 20%, he said. Quite a range. 0%, oh good. 2%, 20%, you bastards! That should have been on the packet! He said, referring to the percentage of people with vaccine-associated myocarditis who could experience long-term heart consequences. We don't know the answer. We don't know the answer. Finally, a little bit of honesty. I look forward to seeing that guy in a jungle or ice skating or on a dolphin's back telling us that it was all a big joke and that he fell in love and he made some mistakes. PolitiFact said Facebook previously flagged myocarditis studies in its effort to combat false news and misinformation on its newsfeed. One of the aspects of this story has been censorship. Don't let these kind of shows and these kind of conversations fool you into thinking that there is transparency. This I would regard as still management of the information. Again, I'm not suggesting there's a conspiracy. There doesn't need to be a conspiracy when interests converge, as George Carlin always pointed out. If people have generally the same interests, there's no requirement for an explicit conspiracy. If mainstream media, government, big tech, big business are all porous organisations with revolving doors between them, there is no need for explicit conspiracy. Pfizer files were due to be fully released in 75 years. In 75 years, we'll have reality TV shows where Albert Baller, propped up using AI and vampire blood, totters about in some sort of snowscape, building igloos and laughing about all this in some post-apocalyptic reality show in which the few remaining humans giggle and chuckle and congratulate themselves and one another on a perfectly functioning democracy. I would say that Matt Hancock's appearance on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and the admission that there are aspects of vaccine health and consequences that were not openly discussed when it was important and relevant to do so, shows us that what we're living in is a kind of spectacular reality, where what we have instead of democracy is the appearance of democracy, where what we have instead of honest conversation are contrived encounters after the fact with no ability to change our reality or our society or our systems based on the information that we are acquiring. Even when new regulation is introduced to control farmer pricing in the United States of America, we hear that it won't meaningfully impact their profits. We are living in a rigged system, and the only time you get a chance to vote is when it doesn't mean anything, is when it's part of a reality TV show. Your vote in the midterms, your vote in elections will lead to more or less the exact system you've got now. And that's what you should be thinking about. But that's just what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what you think in the chat. I'll see you in a moment.